So it's a sad duty that I have to report that, at least for my loyal viewers, that the war has ended on turn number 22. So again, I needed a 1 through 7 for the war to end, and I rolled a 4. So the war has concluded after 22 turns, January of 47. So, and we'll talk about exactly who won here in a few minutes. If we just want to go over the action from turn 22. So Germany continued to make inroads into Russia. So as you can see, the Germans were right at the doorstep to Moscow. Russia had pulled everything back into Moscow that they could, and they were in the process of building a fortification that they were going to put on this bordering this land zone here, Western Russia, to block off this stack of German mechs and artillery from coming over, at least without suffering the penalty from the fortification. The Russians would have put up a pretty good defense. That's about 15 infantry, about 12 medium armor, about 8 heavy armor, and 3 mechanized. The Germans would have been able to come in with about 15 each self-propelled artillery and mechs, plus 1 territory behind in Leningrad. They would have been able to bring about 6 Stukas, 6 fighters, a Tiger, and there's a couple other mechs that are in other territories adjacent to Western Russia that would have been able to make it. So it would have been an interesting battle. If the war would have continued another turn, I'm sure, even though that would have probably been a close run thing, Germany probably would have done it just to avoid having to run into the fortification if they would have waited an additional turn. So not sure exactly who would have won that. Like I said, I think it would have been close, but didn't have to come to that because, again, the die roll ended the conflict. Besides that, Germany brought over a bunch of men on transports from eastern Germany, so they were in Leningrad as well. Down in southern Russia, since the Germans had moved up a bunch of units, a couple of Tigers and some medium armor were down in the southern Ukraine. They also had come into North Caucasus here. The Russians did take it back on their turn, but the Germans had dropped down a couple more Fallschirmjäger in Romania. So they were poised to maybe go after Stalingrad this turn, and it was only defended with 3 cavalry because, again, the Russians had to pull pretty much everything back to Moscow. Germans had some more units coming over, 5 mechs here in East Poland. They had a decent air force down in Romania, a couple fighters, a couple of Stukas, a couple of transports. So they were poised to pretty much take all of southern Russia on this next turn, regardless of how the battle for Moscow turned out. And the Germans, for defensive purposes, seeing what the British were starting to do, they dropped down 8 infantry in western Germany. So that's a stack of about a dozen infantry there. And for the first time in the game, and I don't have black for this unit, I think they only come in gray, or maybe I couldn't get black, I'm not sure. But anyways, we got the Me-262 jet fighter. That's the sculpt for that gray jet there. So the Germans purchased 4 of those, and they put those down in Berlin. So Germany was sitting really well. Another thing I forgot to mention was at the end of the previous turn, when the Germans had took Transcaucasus, Turkey aligned with Germany. So I went ahead and swapped out at the end of that combat turn of Germany's all of the Turkish units for German. So the Germans went up the Turkish IPP territory value of 3, plus they had started going into Iran as well and took that. So at the end of the Germans' turn, they were sitting at around $77, not counting bonuses. So they were getting a huge amount of money. And with Turkey in the Axis camp, that gave Germany access to beefing up southern Russia here in the Caucasus, or even going down in the Middle East, how they started going into Iran there. So Germany was definitely looking good. Russia was knocked back on their heels. The Russians did come over on their portion and take the 2 Mongolian territories that were worth IPP points. So that would have normally given them a couple of victory points, and it did, but it got negated, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So Russia was pretty much knocked back on their heels, just awaiting the German assault into Moscow. If we would have headed into turn 23. As far as the British, they put down some transports and a couple more destroyers, so they were in position on this next turn to take 8 infantry, plus they have a stack of fighters in London. They were going to come over somewhere. Possibly they were looking at Western Germany until the Germans dropped all those infantry there, so maybe they would have tried to land in France somewhere, used the fighters maybe to go after some of the German infantry, so there wouldn't have been as many infantry to counterattack the British infantry that landed maybe in Normandy on turn 23 if it would have happened. Other than that, the British also in the Middle East went ahead, and once Turkey aligned with Germany, they went ahead and attacked in Kars here. There was like 2 German infantry, a militia, and artillery. They did have to sacrifice a couple of planes because they only had 1 ground unit, which they lost that on the artillery's first strike. So they ended up losing a couple of planes, but they wanted to get those German ground units out of there so that they weren't just kind of running wild down here into Iran and maybe even coming over to Africa. So, and then the British just dropped the planes down there. So the Germans really weren't going to be able to make their way into the Middle East anytime soon. I mean, there really isn't much left in Turkey. So the British kind of headed off that avenue of a possible German assault. As far as the Italians, they went ahead, again, because not knowing if the game's going to end at the end of the current turn, they went ahead and finished off a heavy cruiser, and that would have given them twice as many capital ships in the Mediterranean as the Allies. So the Allies have absolutely no capital ships. So they finished off the heavy cruiser. They also built a destroyer to help protect it, and they did have 3 fighters they scrambled. But the U.S. took their 6 fighters that were over here in West Africa, and knowing that the Italians can get a victory point for having that cruiser, they went ahead and sent their 6 fighters over. The Italians scrambled the 3 fighters, and the U.S., at the loss of 4 fighters, took out the 3 Italian fighters and both ships, the heavy cruiser and the destroyer. So that prevented the Italians from getting that victory point. Besides that, the U.S. also put down a bunch of naval units here off of Washington. They put down 4 light carriers, and because they have improved construction, you can either take $1 off the cost of each item, or you can do the first 2 stages of production in one stage. So in essence, it allows you to skip a stage. You still have to pay, the full price for it. So the U.S. went ahead and put 4 light carriers down this turn, along with 4 tacticals and a couple of destroyers. So they were going to bring this fleet over with these transports and pick up these men this next turn, and then be in a position the following turn to maybe go into Italy somewhere. Another thing I forgot to mention, the Italians did land in Gibraltar on their turn, so that gave them a couple of extra bucks. Didn't turn out to matter, and then one other thing I think I mentioned incorrectly, and again, this was me confusing the Global 39 and the Global 36 rules. So in 39, Germany has 2 of the 3. If they capture 2 of the 3 Russian cities between Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, then Spain aligns with them. In this game, and that's what I had mentioned a couple turns ago, maybe, and that isn't how Spain aligns this turn. They've got to have Gibraltar and Egypt, Cairo, or London. And obviously London is still under British control, and Cairo potentially could have went Axis because there's no units down there. The Germans could have dropped their Fallschirmjäger down there this next turn. So that could have potentially activated Spain. But Spain doesn't get activated in this game by having 2 of those 3 Russian cities. And I think that's how I presented it a turn ago. Again, I was just confusing 36 and 39. So that's about it. So kind of recapping in Europe, I think Germany obviously was the strongest power on this side of the map by far. They were in no danger of losing really any home territory. They had started beefing up the defense of both Berlin and West Germany. Depending on if Moscow would have fell this turn, then all their resources would have then been put towards building up a navy and building up even more of an air force to go after the British. So, and the battle for Moscow itself, maybe about 50-50, maybe a little bit in Germany's favor. Germany actually would have has the resources and has the income where even if they would have went in and lost that battle, the Russians wouldn't have had much left in Moscow, and the Germans, just with double the income, really would have still been able to outpace the Russians in terms of rebuilding up a force to then go into Moscow again. So I think that it was only a matter of another turn or two, and maybe Russia would have been defeated. Italy didn't do a whole heck of a lot. They started out, once they got into the conflict, they were actually pretty strong here in North Africa, but it didn't really take a whole lot for the British and the Americans to, once the Americans got in the conflict, to kind of team up on the Italians, completely push them out of Africa. There was no sense in building an Italian navy through most of the game once their initial fleets got destroyed, just because the Allies had so much air power in the Mediterranean that you're only building a couple of ships at a turn for the Italians. They just don't have the income to drop down 5 or 6 ships in a turn. And those couple of ships you drop down a turn are just going to get destroyed from the Allied Air Force that was in the Med. So no sense in doing that. So Italy kind of switched gears and went ahead and started buying airborne units, dropping them off at some of these undefended islands in the Med just to secure that victory objective, which is if Italy possesses 2 or more land zones they did not possess at the beginning of the game, regardless of the IPP value, they get victory points there. So that was basically all Italy was trying to do. They also had built up a nice air force. They were spending most of their money, especially in the mid part of the game, on air units, and that actually helped out a lot. They were able to pick off some Allied ships in the Med, and they were able, especially once they got long-range aircraft technology, to fly over with no issues and attack Allied units here in North Africa. So I think that was pretty good. But Italy obviously, they just don't have the income, especially if the U.S. and the British are both devoting a lot of their effort to taking Italy out. They're just not going to be able to keep up and really contribute a whole heck of a lot to the Axis. I mean, it was good that Italy hung on, didn't lose any territory in Italy itself, and they were still fairly strong both in northern Italy and Rome. But other than that, they were mostly just hanging on the last probably 6 or 7 turns of the game. As far as the U.S., I guess both for them and the British, they never landed back in Western Europe, so that's definitely an issue. If Germany can devote pretty much their entire effort to the Russian front, it's going to be tough for the Allies and the Comintern to pull out a victory. Germany just kind of got rolling with income, built up enough defenses in Western Europe to really dissuade the British from landing. The U.S. had some bad rolls as far as their entering the conflict. It took them a while to get into the game. So the British were kind of standing alone for quite a while, and they just allowed Germany to just build up some defenses. The German U-boats were around mid-game starting to make their presence felt, convoying the British for a bunch of money and just giving the British and the U.S. some headaches. So the Western Allies never able to land back in Europe. They did all their damage in Africa and the Middle East. Maybe there should have been more of a concerted effort on the British and the U.S.'s part to land back in Western Europe, just to at least distract Germany a little bit from throwing everything at the Russians. But Germany definitely, by far, the strongest power on the European side. In the Pacific, as we take a look at the map, Japan is really getting squeezed. It's kind of the opposite of how good the Axis were doing on the European side. The Pacific part of the map here is going all Allied. So Japan had come down on this last turn and took out the transports and destroyers that the Far East Command and Anzac had down in these money islands down here, and they needed to get rid of them so that they couldn't continue to transport guys to some of these other undefended islands. They also put down some more ships, 3 subs, 4 destroyers, 3 light carriers to help defend the Japanese home waters there. That was about it for Japan. Not a whole heck of a lot they can do. And then on the Allied portion of the turn, Japan really had some trouble. They only had a couple units left on mainland China, and the Communist Chinese took them out. So there's just absolutely not even a single Japanese unit on the continent of Asia here. The few territories they have left are all undefended, so they were just going to be walk-ins for the CCP and possibly the Far East Command. So they were absolutely no presence in China whatsoever. Then the Far East Command came down and used their entire Air Force, and they had a pretty decent Air Force. They had about a half a dozen fighters and tacticals, and they came down here to Sea Zone 132 and took out, they were in Sea Zone 123 and took out that Japanese fleet, which was, I think, 5 light cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 2 light carriers with 2 fighters. They completely wiped out that fleet, and then the planes flew down here and landed in Java. So there is absolutely no Japanese naval presence in the South Pacific either. Anzac followed that up by coming over and taking Celebes. They also took Sarawak back for the FEC. And they actually used their fighters based here in Dutch New Guinea just to take out lone Japanese infantry that were in the Mariana Islands and Palau. They didn't lose anything in the process, so just to completely clear out those islands in case the U.S. wanted to come down there. And then the U.S. brought everything they had from Hawaii and San Francisco over here to Wake. The Japanese had threw up a couple destroyers for screening purposes, blockers. The U.S. took out both of those and then are sitting just 2 sea zones away from Japan with 5 light carriers, 3 tacticals, 2 fighters, about 4 destroyers, 6 transports, 6 medium armor, and 6 infantry. So Japan, maybe not on this next turn, depending on what the Japanese did with their navy. They might actually come on out, although they might have to take out these destroyers that are screening. They could, I guess, come up here, go 1, 2, 3, and avoid the 2 destroyers that are screening for the U.S. But I'm not sure that Japan would have won that naval battle. If they did, that'd be pretty much everything. So, and they would have to hope they would take out the U.S. transports, because if not, then the U.S. could just land on this next turn with those 6 medium armor and 6 infantry. So Japan is pretty much bottled up just to the home islands. They're down to only $21. They still did have some decent income bonuses, because they do still hold some of the money islands and some of the bonus income objectives in general. So they did get a decent amount, I think maybe like $10 worth of extra money, plus their wartime economy roll. But they were pretty much done for. I think Japan, the biggest mistake with them was they didn't necessarily concentrate on at least taking out, an opponent at a time. I mean, if you look here in the Pacific, you potentially have as adversaries for the Japanese, obviously the Far East Command, Anzac, the United States, China, whether Communist Chinese or National Chinese, the CCP or the KMT win, and even potentially Russia and Japan could go to war. So, and there's really no help that, the Germans or the Italians can give to Japan. They're kind of on their own out here in the Pacific. So if they don't kind of take advantage of the U.S. being out of the war for so many turns to start the game into mid-game, especially if the U.S. has shitty rolls, they're not going to get into the game till maybe, 8, 9, 10 turns into the game, depending on, obviously your actions will increase the U.S. economy towards war. But if you kind of avoid anything that completely provokes the U.S., then Japan really needs to take advantage of that time to maybe completely take out at least one or two of these opponents down here. So maybe go after China hardcore, or if you're going to go for the Money Islands, maybe go after the Far East Command, something so that once the U.S. is in the conflict, and that's going to be your main adversary going forward, especially if the U.S. concentrates in the Pacific, then at least at that point you've taken out one or two opponents prior to that, and you're not getting ganged up on by 4, 5, 6 different opponents. So once the U.S. got into it, started applying pressure, and none of the allies had been completely taken out by the Japanese. They did have both Anzac and the Far East Command back on their heels for several turns. And they did have complete control of the South Pacific down here and all these Money Islands. But again, they didn't completely take out any one opponent, and they just kind of rejuvenated, so to speak. And you see the end result here where Japan's alone. And Hirohito is probably going to have to sue for peace if the game hadn't ended when it did, because Tokyo itself was under serious threat. As far as the scoring goes, so we'll take a look over there, and I hope I got the scoring right. So it's an Axis victory. So they have 13 plus 1 victory city, so I'm assuming that obviously that would be 14. But I'm not sure. Germany's the one that took that victory city, but they're already maxed out at 7. So I'm not sure exactly how that affects the scoring. So either way, it's not going to affect the outcome. But Germany maxed themselves out with the maximum 7 victory points they could get. Italy had 3, and Japan actually was still holding on with 3. Now, that was only a matter of time. Like I said, this very next turn, and Japan could have been out of the game. So the Axis definitely got lucky. The game ended when it did. So 13 plus the 1 victory city of Paris, courtesy of the Wehrmacht, $14 victory objective points for the Axis. The Comintern, the CCP actually had 3, plus they also have a victory city, Nanking, from the KMT. So that would give the Comintern 4, all by CCP. And the reason why the USSR has none is they actually would have had, I believe, 3 victory points. But in the rules, when it comes to the scoring, it says you deduct 1 victory point for each land zone in your home country that has an IPP value that's enemy occupied. And the Germans have a whole bunch of Russian territories in Russia's home country that have at least 1 or more IPP value. So they had gotten 3, but they all got wiped out. I mean, Germany probably has double, maybe even triple that amount of territory under control in Russia that has an IPP value. So Russia contributed nothing. As far as the Allies go, the U.S. had 3. The U.K. had 2. Anzac had 1. And then France would have had 1 because no communist units are bordering the French territory, but they obviously have French territory under German control. And then the Far East Command would have contributed 1 point, but Ceylon is enemy occupied. So they finished with 6. So it was an Axis victory at 14, the Allies at 6, and the Comintern at 4. And that's how things ended after turn 22. Definitely made my fair share of mistakes. It was like a learning process. I appreciate all the comments. Hopefully going to get another game started here pretty quick, probably within a couple of days here. And hopefully I won't be making the same mistakes. We'll see if the Axis can pull out another victory here at game number 2 of Global 36. Thanks for watching.